next session is on the future of public services, and I'd like to invite up Alfredo and Jenny to come along. And this is the future of public services. It's about considering the policy challenges across public services, including outsourcing, privatisation, underfunding, access and quality. Our first presenter is Alfredo Saad. Is it Filho or Philo? Alfredo, I never really know. Filho. Alfredo is the Professor of Political Economy and International Development, UCL, previously Professor of Political Economy at SOAS, was Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. His work is published, you'll know his work is published in 15 languages, research currently on political economy development, industrial policy, neoliberalism, democracy and alternative economic policies, Latin American political and economic development, obviously, and inflation and stabilization, and the labour theory of value and its applications. Alfredo covers, his work is quite extensive and comprehensive. Alfredo.
Thank you, John, and thanks. Thanks, John and Madeleine, for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be with you today. What I'm going to do is look at the role of public policy and public services in a world of converging crises in the economy, as was highlighted earlier today, an indefinitely long stagnation in the West, punctuated by a catastrophic finance-driven crisis, a crisis in politics marked by the erosion of democracy and the rise of new forms of fascism, a crisis in health expressed by the disasters of the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course a crisis of the environment with implications for employment, for trade, for production, for food supplies, for water supplies, and so on, implications for life as we know it. If we cannot address these crises, we risk submerging into a systemic crisis of social reproduction with very severe implications for the poor and for the poor countries. But for context, let me start by taking a few steps back. The rise of neoliberal financialization since the 1970s led to the transfer of state capacity to allocate resources away from Keynesian states in the global north, developmental states in the global south, and into a globally integrated financial system. And this is what allowed finance to control the main sources of capital and to control the most important levers of economic policy in most countries in the world. And this had a very strong impact on public service provision, because while neoliberal policymakers always claim to be reducing the size of the state to leave more space for the market, and the market is efficient and the state is not, what they're actually doing is to rebuild the state, to intervene on a discretionary basis to promote a globalizing and financialized capitalism. And as they do this, they instrumentalize public policy to destroy collectivity deliberately through privatizations, through means testing, through the erosion of the rights of citizenship, destroying deliberately the notion of the social and the collective. Under neoliberalism, every problem is an individual problem, or it should become an individual problem. There are no social problems, or there shouldn't be any. Financialization also restructured provision as part of a process of creating new financial instruments and new asset classes, supporting the capitalization of value streams embedded in the production of public goods and public services, with profitability guaranteed by the state. We see this in the UK in public service areas that have been privatized, and at the same time provision becomes increasingly erratic for the most vulnerable in society. So while policymakers talk about competition and efficiency and that as the measure of the success of public policy, they also downgrade the alternative goals of universal provision, social equity, environmental sustainability. This type of restructuring of public services also reinforced systemic tendencies towards short-termism, towards speculation, towards extraction of value under neoliberalism, and that changed the character of the neoliberal state, and it also increased economic volatility under which we live right now. So it's not a surprise that instead of economic advancement, progress, wealth creation, what we have seen, particularly in the core countries in the West, is an economic slowdown that has lasted for decades already, and between 2007 and 2020, the West suffered the longest economic calamity and the weakest and the most regressive economic recovery on record, that affected the UK especially badly, as my colleagues have shown earlier today. And then we had the pandemic and the current economic crisis after the pandemic. Now, this is on the economic side. But in addition to the economic side, in parallel to the economic side, to the economic crisis of neoliberalism, we have the degradation, the political degradation of neoliberal democracies. Democracies that were already circumscribed and limited by an institutional apparatus that was designed to lock in neoliberalism, designed to insulate economic policy from any form of democratic accountability and any form of interference by the majority of the population. This is about independent central banks. This is about inflation targeting regimes. This is about maximum fiscal deficits and privatizations and public-private partnerships. That is all political. It has nothing to do with economic efficiency, quite the contrary. Now, this institutional setup reduced enormously the policy space available even to democratic states, even to nominally democratic states. The structures of political representation became increasingly unresponsive, and public policy became increasingly indifferent to the majority. So the people who lost out economically the most under neoliberalism were also being ignored systematically by the institutions of neoliberalism. And once economic policy became out of bounds, then the political space tended to be occupied by corrosive and socially destructive conflicts around culture, around religion, around nationalism, and around racism. And this is what I believe opened the space for the spread of anti-systemic forces, with the left having been destroyed in the previous stage. Anti-systemic forces polarized by the political right and polarized and dominated by what I call spectacular authoritarian leaders, people who thrive in politics by cultivating a politics of resentment, and people who try to reconstitute a divisive and exclusionary form of collectivity through appeals to nationalism and racism. And this was a situation we had until early 2020 when the pandemic came. And what the pandemic did was not to create new problems. The pandemic intensified those tensions that we had already experienced before. Economies collapsed one after the other. And particularly in authoritarian neoliberal political system, public policies became often catastrophically perverse and imposed health policies that ended up killing millions of people unnecessarily, and that entrenched COVID-19 so it can never again be eliminated from the world. And this was the worst policy failure in the age of neoliberalism, and my God, there were many of those. And the experience in the United States, in the UK, in India, in Brazil, in other countries, contrasts very sharply with the successes in other countries that focused on the protection of life instead of the protection of short-term profits, showing that what happened in this country and in other countries was a political decision. And those outcomes, there has to be accountability for those outcomes. Now, the differentiated impact of the pandemic within countries and between countries, that showed the importance of health, of housing, the importance of public good and service provision, and the mutually reinforcing effects of provision of public goods and services. And it also showed the impact of low wages, poor working conditions, poor housing in neoliberal societies, with the effect being felt particularly by minorities and by the least healthy. At the same time, we see our political systems being slowly but relentlessly overwhelmed by the environmental crisis and by climate change. And that relates fundamentally to the contradiction between the infinite search for profits under capitalism and the limited carrying capacity of the earth to support a climate that is compatible with the continuation of life as we know it. And public policies to address climate change in this country and around the world have been limited by tensions between the accumulated emissions by the leading Western economies, the countries that got rich first, and the rising emissions in developing countries that claim the right to development right now and find obstacles in the structure of a global economy where many countries are heavily invested in the production of fossil fuels, even though everyone knows that that is unsustainable, but those countries refuse to exit. Now, all those tensions, they have been intensified by financialization, because financialization tends to raise emissions and block mitigation because it feeds behaviors that reinforce the existing economic structures, that increase volatility, that concentrate income, concentrate wealth, concentrate power. And this is incompatible with public policies focusing on climate adaptation, strategic industrial policy, or redistribution. So what we have is a situation where leaving oil in the ground, diversifying energy supplies, securing macroeconomic stability and sustainability, redistribution, these challenges have to be addressed together. And they have to be addressed together, moving away from neoliberalism for reasons of political legitimacy of the strategy, for reasons of practicality of policy implementations, for reasons of effectiveness. There will be costs and there will be sacrifices addressing climate change. And those costs and sacrifices will get public support only if they are connected to a reversal of the excluding logic of neoliberalism. And for this, we need a democratic economic strategy that focuses on the reconstitution and the expansion of political democracy, focuses on the restoration of a collective sphere of citizenship and the expansion of rights, that focuses on the distribution of income and wealth and power, that focuses on the decommodification and definancialization of social reproduction, starting with universal public services, and that focuses on a green transition in energy and the economy. Now, in a democratic economic strategy, we'll need public services and we'll need efficient delivery of public services and public goods. And for that, we'll need, I think, two conditions. First, they have to respond to the imperative of universal provision. Everyone is a citizen of the same world, of the same society. And we'll need those public services to operate with slack. What we have seen in this country in particular is called pursuit, well, they call it pursuit of efficiency, is to cut to the bone public services and then expect them to function well. Public services do not function well under those circumstances because public goods and public services are fundamentally different from private goods, where the market operates better when companies are close to 100% capacities. If you take apples, provision in the marketplace can be rationed by price, it can be rationed by quantity. If you're rationed out, you can, in an efficient market, you can buy bananas or you can buy pears instead. It's not the same with public goods and services. If there are no school places, no hospital, no buses near you, you cannot substitute. You either go private or you go without. And those policies have those alternatives, they have very severe implications for those people who will be unable to provide for themselves regardless of need. And this implies a violation of citizenship and sometimes a risk to life. It's completely different from not having bananas. And this is why the provision of public services and public goods has to be premised on universal rights. Public goods and public services also tend to be, as we're discovering now, also tend to be intensive in skilled labor. And that skilled labor has to be paid well and not squeezed, because there is a duality between lack of alternative services and lack of alternative employment opportunities for the staff. And lack of alternative skills in the labor market. If the staff leaves, that's a loss forever. So with profuse apologies, nurses and ambulance drivers and train drivers are not the same thing as accountants and HR staff, and doctors are not the same thing as general managers. These are different qualities of work. So let me wrap up. Progressive policies have to be critical, particularly in times of crises. Otherwise, we become just apologists for the status quo, apologists for exploitation, apologists for the reproduction of inequality within nations and between nations, apologists for the destruction of the conditions of life on earth. What we're facing here today is a neoliberal modality of capitalism that prospers through despoliation, prospers through extraction, prospers through fraud, and that is sliding into a permanent state of economic crisis, sliding into fascism, sliding into environmental collapse. It is urgent to advance a transformative agenda centered on public services. Now, the difficulty is that to think of these alternative policies and agendas, we need to have a social base for them. We need new social movements. We need new structures of representation. We need political parties that are active. We need trade unions that are active. We need community associations. We need them to correspond to the mode of existence of the society in which we live, a society that has been extensively decomposed domestically, that has been imperfectly integrated at a global level, society that has very different cultures, but that is very heavily connected through internet-based tools, a society that has very important demands and expectations around public services, but has no space for this agenda to play out or even to be discussed. We can see successes, though. We can see important successes, for example, under Corbyn and John. We're not there yet, as we know. I think there's nothing more important right now than to build those movements and to support that agenda and change our modes of living. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Nguyen. She's a research fellow in mission-oriented innovation policy at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. She's currently investigating industrial policies and the role of the state in public services and agencies, published a series of report for Public Services International on COVID-19's impact on public systems and on energy outlooks in Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. She's currently leading research on narratives in public spending in low and middle-income countries, focusing on understanding global, regional and national narratives around public service budgets and provision. Jenny, thanks.
Thank you, everyone, first of all, for staying here this time. It has been a really long day, but and I actually, especially for me, because actually I woke up about 3 a.m. this morning. I still can stand because of lots of coffee, but actually more than that, more importantly, because of the exciting talks that I have heard today. And of course, thank John and the organizers for inviting me today to talk to you. Just to say, I do not complain about the 3 a.m. morning wake up. I just want to say maybe I will be quite incoherent sometimes, so please bear with me. When I was invited to talk about the future of public services, I thought really long and hard about how can I be earnestly and honestly optimistic about the future of public services, given what is going on in the political scenes and also the persistent dominance of mainstream economics. But I wish to attempt, and hopefully after my sharing today, I and also you could also feel a little bit more optimistic. So my talk would have 3 main parts. So the first part, I want to reiterate the problem of mainstream economics when it comes to understanding the public economy and its myopic view of public services. The second part, I would like to draw your attention to a distant past of 6000 BC when economics was not existent, to investigate how the very first organized governments made promises to the public by delivering essential public services. Hopefully. I would then end with a couple of key findings from a recent conference organized by a global diverse partnerships of universities, trade union confederations, and social movements at UCL that I led last year, which actually aims to shift the current narratives. And we're still trying, but we hope to give you a bit of the findings here so that we can together move on. So the first part is about the crisis of mainstream economics. I think the public sector has long been facing a crisis which is inherent from the way economics is primarily understood. From the very first economics lesson, we assume that there are limited resources and finite resources, and humans have unlimited ones. We all face the problem of scarcity. Then it naturally leads to the argument for competition. And from here, whenever there is a dissatisfaction with the quality of public services provided by the public sector, neoclassical economists would point to the problem of the lack of competitiveness and inefficiency of public sector. And the prescription that they give includes a combination of privatization, corporatizations, and liberalization of public services. And the prescription did not go very far in customization and became a worldwide trend in the late 1980s and towards the 1990s, and is still going on. And until now, there are more than 90 countries around the world that have partially or fully implemented the economic policy, the economic policy influenced by neoclassical economics, with the hope for a better quality, affordable prices, and private investment in public services. However, global empirical evidences does not show this, and even in the UK, where it all started in the late 1980s. In order to include private participation, there are costs, right, including cost of opening and monitoring markets, cost of policy implementations, cost of incentives given to the private sector. These overheads are often not mentioned, and in my own research, I can give you an example in the Southeast Asia. In the electricity sector alone, a third of government guarantee loans from the World Bank and the ADB, Asian Development Banks, were for policy reforms, which otherwise could be spent on infrastructure. And the IMF, the IFIs, international financial institutions, including IMF, World Bank Group, and other multilateral development banks, have a plethora of tools, and majority of their current tools, to influence and impose the narratives, including conditionalities, policy advice, research and report output, and training. However, private investor would not simply come in when a door to the market opens. They demand purchase agreement, guarantees, tax reduction, tariffs, and other financial incentives. Yet what has come is very minimal. Also in the same region, only about 1 to 3% of investment into electricity generation in South Asia comes from truly private investors. What I mean by truly is that after I do a lot of research and data collection, many of those that actually say, private companies are not really private companies. They are actually hidden identities for government and public companies. Now, in the end, what we want for public services is affordability, accessibility, and sustainability, but we haven't found it in countries that have pursued liberalizations, marketizations, and privatizations for the last 20 to 30 years. So what we have seen is how this presumption of scarcity and also how privatization and liberalization works has failed the public services. Therefore, we need an alternative to what the mainstream economics actually now offering us. So I would come to the second part, was when I really struggle with trying to find out what theories I can resort to explain how public services could be constructed, could be efficient, but I haven't found anything in the current economics teaching. So what I did was actually, I think, well, maybe I should go to a time when economics did not exist. Is that just a few centuries ago, right? If we actually date back to, Adam Smith or further than that. And then the further I go, I just realize that infrastructures like roads and water services actually existed long time, even before we have economics as a discipline. So I have a questions to the audience here, because I know that all of you are actually very knowledgeable, but I have a question. Do you know when was the first public service when did the first public service come to existence? Sorry? China? All over the place. Exactly. So all over the place. So that's where, but when? Do you have the questions to when? The time? Can we give a bit of like a time frame? 1700? Sorry, 1700? Sorry.
15,000 years ago was the imposition of private property. In armies to defend the thieves. That was the first so-called public service. If you consider that the thieves are part of the public.
A part of the public. So I think I gave you a bit of a hint in the beginning, right? About 6,000 years ago. But I think it could have existed a little bit before that. So the word public comes from populus, a Latin word meaning the people, and the word publicus, a Latin word meaning of the people. So the ancient Roman public contractors were recorded to be publicanus, sorry, I'm very bad at Latins, meaning in the public sector. So you're thinking, wait, are you talking that the Romans invented public services? Well, I mean, I try and look for the very first ever Roman aqueduct was built for the city of Rome back in 312 BC by Appius Claudius Caesar. And this service of channeling water to the city via the aqueducts for the use of the general public is actually quite equivalent to the water services today. However, if we looked at the very first cities, and I mean cities, I'm not talking about towns and things at the time where we actually didn't have anything, that seems to be an organized government. So the very first ancient cities in the world, it's very interesting that they existed, ranging from like a few 6,000 years ago to a few about 4,000, 3,000 BC. Without any direct contact with each other, they all have something in common. They all provided similar public services. And what I learned from artifacts and writings, manuscript, is that they all developed a complex system of water and waste management services for irrigation and household use, religious services like temples and other worshipping services, and communal spaces. And these public services corresponding to humans' basic needs constructed the legitimacy of the very first cities, but also later, when they're gone and or the provision of these public services were not maintained by the government, the loss of the governments at that time. So I just give you a name. They are the ancient city of Uruk, 4000 to 3000 BC, now in Iraq, ancient Liangzhu, city-state, 5700 to 4300 BC, now in China, so you're right as well. Mohenjo-Daro, 2600 to 1900 BC, and now in Pakistan. So these are the three cities that I have investigated. Now, the economies of the cities were mainly reliant on water supply and rainfall, and their products were grains, crafts, pottery, jetware. Their societies were stratified with kings or priest-kings and the ruling class. Not simply extracting the resources, the ruling noblemen built the city with proper conditions, not only for them, but for the economic activities and for the people as well. And I'll tell you why it is for the people as well, because many of you were thinking, well, you know, what they do is to actually extract. Is that it was recorded that complex hydraulic engineering projects requiring thousands of people were built for the benefit of the city. So it was written that time. Benefit of the city's own inhabitants, and it required advanced planning, design and logistics in construction, operation, and continual maintenance. So that's the very first public service. The second confirmed public service is the community religious practices, which not only, when you think about it, is not just temples for the kings, but also the common place for the general public to sit down, watch performances, and pray together. And rituals were performed usually in the central area of the cities, open to all, no tickets required. Now, the third public service is urban planning of the cities, involved major constructions of streets, communal buildings, fortresses, temples, and most notably, public buildings and individual houses. Records of city-wide plans and standardized mud bricks were found across the city. So there's a lot of efforts were done by these ancient people, ancient societies, ancient governments, which actually, I don't know, do we have that at this time? That much of public service at this time, this day and age. And many, many times I go to British museums and I look at these artifacts of thousands of years ago and I think, have we moved forward? Well, so as a reminder, we just looked at the very first cities. Why the very first cities? Because that's the time where people could choose to live there or choose to move. We don't have that kind of freedom right now. We are tied by certain social contracts if we're born a citizen of a certain country. But it also proved to you that public services existed since the very first formation of organized societies, and they actually arose from practical needs of the citizens and also the political agenda of the rulers. And they give reasons for people to form and stay in the societies. So so we actually looked at a bit of theoretical economics, and we looked at the past a little bit. So I want to talk to you about something that just happened last year, to give you a bit of hope. So last year, in about June 2022, the conference name was Shifting Narratives, the Political Economy of Public Spending, Services and Production. Now, in short, I call it Shifting Narratives. It was organized with over 100 speakers, 66% from Global South, 58% of women. It actually was a forum to bring people, bring together experience and insights and tools of academics, young socials with the social movement, activists, trade unions, media, NGO in creating narrative shifts. And you're actually asking questions. Why do you need these kind of conference where normally academics will meet with academics, activists meet with activists? But actually, when myself and other academics met with a number of confederations like PSI, Public Services International, TNI, Oxfam, we will realize the fact that we don't want to be living in silos. We need to act collectively, and we need to think think collectively, understand the collective knowledge about narratives, about public services before we can actually act, right? And when we act, we're going to act wisely. So, and actually, what we achieved in the 4 days of conference were the understanding that narratives have been quite similar so far across the world when it comes to public services. So we realized that hostile narratives around public services and public sector spending as unaffordable and inefficient have become dominant through a political process of promotion by corporations, IFIs, consultants, politicians, and mainstream academics. However, we start to realize also at the time, and quite recently, positively, there exists case of positive narratives driving, for example, education, public education in Ghana, rapid development of public services in New Delhi, or even economic planning for public goods and workers' welfare embedded in Bidenomics and Americans' job plan. So we realized that even though in 2022, it was reported that public expenditure austerity cuts are expected in 159 countries, targeting social protection, cuts, caps, public wage bills, and casualizations of public employment, PPPs, and privatization, they are faced with widespread public resistance in forms of academic research, collaboration of community groups, and social campaigns. So there's a bit of hope to the end of the tunnel. Well, hopefully it's not the end, but I was thinking that if public finance accompanied with dynamic evaluation, risk-reward sharing mechanism, directional conditionalities, we could actually change, we could rewind a bit, if hopefully climate change, and we can improve workers' welfare. Now, I'm sorry to take your time too much, so I would like to wrap all of the three parts by saying that it is really crucial for us to remind ourselves that public services are inputs for the use of something else. Even though we pay for utility bills, hospital bills, and tuition fees, what we pay is the end purpose of the services, the abilities to use devices, to have hot food, and the capability for future work and to live healthily. So the fact that the possible use of services is endless, however, the mainstream economics don't frame it like that. That's why they actually just look at a public service like water or electricity as a commodity. They don't really see the plethora of uses of the services that it will provide. So the inefficiency, that is one reason. Now, inefficiency in public sector should be corrected by the government itself rather than labeled as government failures and becoming the argument for private participation. Outsourcing and tendering actually reduce the efficiency of the current system further and are even more costly more costly than corrective actions by the government itself. The tenacity in delivering what the private sector wants. In a politically democratic country, listening to the people is a virtue, but satisfying private greed is not compulsory. And the public sector should be rediscovering its role when realizing that their serving the public is the ultimate goal, and in order to do so, political will is vital. Thank you.
Right, questions, comments, come in. Yeah. Yeah, is there a mic? Thanks. No, actually, Richard, it wasn't you, it was the gentleman here, here, just in front.
Oh, sorry.
Wave your hands, that's it.
Okay. Mike Cushman, I suppose, Jewish Voice for Labour and many other dubious organisations. What I want to talk about is how public services are rotted from within by the ideological domination of market conceptions. Processes which we call isomorphism produce public sector managers who act like private sector managers. And it's how domination is maintained through things like key performance indicators, top-down targets, which means managers become responsive to remote governance and not to their constituency and to their users of their services. This in turn produces a huge bureaucracy of quality assurance and performance management. And we see the domination of these administrative functions over the teaching or healing or firefighting services that the organisations are meant to deliver. Public and voluntary organisations become providers of performance data, not deliverers of services, which leads to competition through league tables, and each school, each hospital is in competition with its neighbours, rather than in a joint enterprise between schools and hospitals, which means when an organisation develops knowledge, it becomes a marketable and organisational asset to maintain league table position and not a public good, which is what it should be. And that produces a death of innovation and a alienation, both actually in the end of the managers and of the people they manage.
John?
Hi, hello. Mine's going to be really short. I've been sitting here learning so much. I'm Naomi Wimborne-Idrisi from Chingford and Woodford Green and other places. Oh, thank you. God. I need to understand growth. You can't hear a bulletin or read a mainstream article or hear a journalist discussing the economy without saying we've got to drive for growth. And we know that means it's complete unsustainability and all the extraction and the ruin. But can somebody who knows about these things tell me how on earth do we turn that back? I read one really good article in the London Review of Books a couple of months ago all about degrowth, and it was reviewing 3 really interesting sounding articles, but I'm an ignoramus. I need somebody to tell me, how do we stop this? It's madness. It's destroying the human race and the planet.
Can I just bring in people who haven't spoken so far? And actually, it wasn't you, but never mind.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. The guy in front of you as well.
Thank you, John. This is not going to be very popular, so I'll try and make it fast. My name's Joe Vosper. First of all, I want to say thanks, Alfredo. That was a really impassioned speech. And I would love to live in the world that you're talking about. Unfortunately, most of the friends that I've made over the past 3 years wouldn't. But you have a common enemy. I'm part of, I advertise about 350 different movements around the world that are trying to curtail government overreach, trying to get justice, trying to start this march towards digital identification, CBDCs, and a whole load of other abuses, and everybody's very scared of the way the future's going. And I've listened to you all today. There's some great ideas. And they suit about half the population, but the other half feel a different way. Wouldn't it be time to go a different way? I've just published this book. It's called 10 Billion States, and it's a completely new philosophy of politics, if you like. It's about universal self-autocracy, a digital system whereby we use the available data to write a constitution, a unique constitution for everybody alive. And through this, we could abolish national governments, We could abolish representative democracy and form treaties based on our own constitution with the people we can ally with and build a completely brand new society. Now, this is a third way. This is a brand new way. And I want you all to give it some consideration. Thanks very much for the invite. I'll be outside handing these leaflets out afterwards. Cheers.
That's all right. Anyone else who's got a book to emphasise, let us know. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm James Whiting, Secretary of the Socialist Education Association. I just wanted to say a little bit about the way things are going on in schools at the moment, because I think we've got a situation through our providers of semi-privatisation, totally unaccountable privatisation, which is delivering actually the Tory agenda, the Tory education agenda, which is something that other public services are not doing. So what we're seeing is a kind of arm's length, pretend it's nothing to do with us, but at the same time delivering a very narrow curriculum, a very cruel almost assessment process at various points in people's life, a total lack of inclusion, a failure on tackling climate change in education, a failure to tackle decolonisation. And in fact, it's not talked about, particularly by the Labour front bench, that the education system is in crisis, but it is. And one of the qualities that I was hoping that somebody would say, and I think you mentioned three about public services, but one of them must be, in my view, because it's been taken away from education, is democratisation. The voice of parents, of pupils, of learners, of teachers has been effectively removed from most schools now. And we're seeing similar things happening in higher education too. So the importance of democracy, I just wonder what the panel thought about the importance of democracy in the delivery of public services as opposed to just efficiency and other measures.
Thanks. In the middle there, if you can. If we're brief, we can get.
Thank you. Hi, my name is James Collister. I work for a council in Essex and I head their economic policy and strategy. I've just got a couple of points to say in response to what's been discussed today. I can confirm that there is increasingly a culture of consultant knows best. Yeah. So whenever we need anything done, especially when it comes to senior leadership, it's pretty much hand it over to consultants, usually part of a big conglomerate of some kind, which is a massive problem because personally I think their work is shoddy and of a poor quality, copy and paste, etc., etc. My second point that I wanted to make was that there's also an issue in terms, I see great potential in work like the public sector, local government working closely with academia and organisations such as the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose as well. But there's also a culture of distrust between certain council leadership members and working with academia, and again, rather giving it to consultants. So I think it's a challenge, just putting it out there that that culture really exists and it really needs to change. And yeah, I'm hoping it can in the future, because I'd rather work with really good organisations like the IAPP rather than WSP. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, I agree. Just behind you, yeah? Just behind you.
Hi, my name's Dave Hall. I just want to say something on behalf of We Own It, which is a hands-on campaigning organisation, which I hope you're all aware of, been going for 10 years. And just draw your attention to a couple of things that We Own It's doing now, which relate quite strongly to many of the things being said today, including what Danny Dorling was saying about the mood is changing, things are shifting, and have been for some years in relation to public services, so that the latest polling shows that there's now substantial 3-to-1 majorities right across the British public for public ownership in not only health and education, but also water, energy, transport, really powerful public support. So in a sense, the political question for us now is not how to win and mobilise support for these policies. It's how do we get the political action to transform. Two areas that we're running campaigns on in the near future relevant to this. One, 25th of February on the NHS in Parliament Square, big demonstration with 557 people bearing placards. Why 557? Because research has just estimated that it's that number of lives have been cost by outsourcing. We want to refocus the public debate away from is the NHS broken to what has been happening to the NHS it's been destroyed by outsourcing policies, and we want to stop that. We want a totally public NHS. Secondly, Great British Energy, which Mary Robertson described this morning as a Pyrrhic victory. We want to make something positive out of that. Next month, we own it's going to be producing a report saying we need to make that a reality, and that reality should include a public supply company as well as public renewable generation. And we'll probably be proposing that Centrica has done so many rubbish things in the last month in terms of making profits, sending bailiffs into the poor, and refusing to provide enough gas storage that it's a prime candidate for public ownership. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Dave. For those who are interested in the issue around public ownership, public service, have a word with Dave. And it's done a tremendous amount of work over the years on advising us, but also the We Own It campaign that started from nothing, got just a group of passengers down in Bristol, has now been the most, I think, most significant campaigning organisation with regard to public ownership, and has sophisticatedly developed ideas around that thanks to the work that Dave has done. Thanks a lot. Can we just bring you both into a final comments on the questions? Is that all right?
Thank you all for your questions and also comments. So I just want to provide very short answers. The first question is public managers to behave similarly to private managers. I don't think they should. Honestly, I think because they work for the public sector, they should have a different performance scorecard, and we should actually think of the people and the outcome of their work as not only a standalone measurement, but also actually as a portfolio of what actually the hospital, not just a single hospital and also a single ward, if we're talking about health services, but actually we think about the sector as a whole, what we actually can do. The second question is about growth. I think I agree with you about the obsessions with growth. And we actually hear a lot about GDP growth, this and that. I was born in developing countries, and I know the obsession is still going on. However, I think it's a very myopic view of what the economy is. And I think, number one, the economy is not the market, and the market is not the whole economy. So we need to actually differentiate these two. And GDP as an indicator is actually an imperfect one to measure the economy, the size of the economy, because a really major size of the economy is the public economy, as a non-productive part of the economy, which actually equally or even more important. And we should think of that part of the economy, the public economy, as a fundamental where actually we can build the public part of the economy on top of it. Because without streets, without electricity, without water, without lightings, anything like that, we basically have no companies functioning, right? So I think that's a different way to think about the economic activities. Now, the third question is about abolish governments. It's very interesting. I don't really have any deep thoughts about it, but I have to say that looking at the very ancient cities, I actually realized that having a government is not a bad thing, is not a negative thing, but how these governments function would be more important, because I think naturally humans act as is actually like a creatures that live in communities, and we actually would need a bit of a leadership. I'm not talking that, about a wise leader or anything like that. Leadership here would not just be one person, would not be just a group of person, but how the opinions are taken into account, and then there must be someone or some group of people would do a different dedicated jobs to, in that ideas, to turn ideas into reality. Fourth questions about democracy in delivering public services. I totally agree with you. And maybe I would just offer you one thing, that we realize that the curriculum of economics being taught in a lot of UK, US, and many other countries' universities are actually really flawed. So we realize that what we have taught students were basically one or two textbooks from like Paul Krugman or other neoclassical economists that actually have not moved on for the last 20 years. So there has been movement from the students, the lecturers as well, to change the curriculum. And I think, SOAS is part of that. UCL, KCLs are really moving forward with progressive curriculum to teach economics. So that's just one example of, actually taking people's opinions in changing the curriculum. And I think when we talk about the culture of consultants know best, I would like to draw your attention to one of the books that's going to be out. I mean, it's not my book, just to say, but it's written by my boss, Mariana Mazzucato. She's actually writing about the big con. Con stands for consultant, but she's talking about how consultancies actually warps the capacity of the government. I think it's a really interesting book, but it also says a lot about how much we rely on what we call experts, right? Not really always experts knows best, because sometimes that's why we need democracy. And again, if I draw your attention to developing countries, that's even worse, that we actually hear a lot about why the developing countries, so many of them, right, 90 countries around the world, follow liberalization model that were implemented started from the UK and Europe, is because we think that the experts in the UK and all of these developed countries know more about their own country. So I can tell you kind of positively, there have been some movements from the regional and local experts to realize that they need a cooperation of what we call local insights and international case studies, the people who knows about international case studies, to work together instead of just relying on an external consultant. Very expensive one, obviously. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Alfredo.
Thanks. My colleague at the back, I am very worried about the future, of course. It's certainly at two levels, and possibly more. One, neoliberalism has led to a destruction of sociability, collectivity, and any sense of togetherness that is deeply destabilizing for human existence and for human societies. That is extremely worrying. And then on top of that, the construction of inequality on the back of this destruction of collectivity. That is deeply unsettling. The other side is climate change. We are on course for breaking the Paris Agreement commitments this year or next year, and on course for global warming of 4 to 7 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Now, that is completely destructive for forms of life, all forms of life, ours included, for people who are already around today, the babies that you see around. They will be alive, hopefully, at the end of this century, and they will suffer, and they will experience a world that would be unrecognizable to us. And that is the fault of capitalism. It is the fault of neoliberalism. And these obstacles have to be addressed. Growth and degrowth. I think that is, it's very different to talk about degrowth in a rich country and to talk about degrowth in a poor country. It is perfectly possible to make the argument that in a society like ours here in the UK, we have more than enough. It's perfectly possible to resolve problems through redistribution, and the carbon consumption in advanced economies per capita is more than sufficient. It is very high, and of the top 1% is extraordinarily wasteful. You can't say this in a poor country, because there would be no political legitimacy to do that. You would not get any traction, and in fact, the problem to be addressed there is a problem of poverty. Now, that is resolved through technology. It is resolved through transfers from the advanced economies. There is no way to escape from the fact that the rich countries have to pay for the climate transition and for the shift in the energy matrix. They have to pay. They have to pay through financial transfers. They have to pay through transfers of technology as well. The next issue of public services, colleagues here have already mentioned the financialization of public services in the UK is especially corrosive across the health service, and privatisation and financialization going together. The hedge funds buying parts of the health service or water provision or other areas of public service. We've seen the PPE scandal during the COVID pandemic. It was absolutely hairy. I'm from Brazil, okay? I've seen corruption. What happened here? I mean, wow, that was incredible. And that is across the board. That is the transformation of schools, the decomposition of the state school system into forced academization, water, transport, electricity, and so on. And behind this appearance of just privatization, you have the financialization of provision, and then provision being conditional not on rights of existence, because you're a human being, you have the right to health, you have the right to education. No, it's conditional on financial profit making, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And this has to be addressed politically, and it will be through political struggle that we're going to reverse that. Neoliberalism has degraded public service provision across the board. Colleagues have mentioned the examples of the number of managers, the evaluations, KPIs, consultants, etc., etc. That is all true, with the fiction that the private sector is efficient and therefore the public sector must emulate, must copy those parameters of supposed efficiency, when the nature of the service is completely different. It is not the same thing. And so provision has to be organized in a different way. And then what the government has been trying to do in this country and in other countries too is prime for abolition, prime public services for abolition, either through direct privatization or through decomposition of the service, as we see in the case of the NHS, or through outright elimination of the service itself, and with it the right of people to be serviced in that particular way. And this is, again, especially scandalous. And it is very, very good, very reassuring to see that there seems to be a shifting of the tide in this country. And this country has influence around the world. And things that happen here do have an impact elsewhere. So the responsibility of everyone here to struggle very, very firmly for the reversal of that trend and for the recomposition of public services in the UK and the establishment of rights to public goods and services, that is important not just in the UK but around the world. So that is another incentive for us to continue to struggle. Thank you very much. Thanks,
Thanks, Alfredo, Jenny. Thank you.